In the lead up to Christmas 2005, the then Conservative opposition in Ottawa brought forward an intriguing election campaign promise. Stephen Harper stood in front of a cash register and said, if elected, the Conservatives would reduce the goods and services tax from 7 to 6 and then to 5%. Harper went on to win his first election in no small measure because of that tax cut promise. What's been the impact of that tax cut? Well, one impact has been a book. It's called Tax is Not a Four-Letter Word, and its co-editor, Alex Himelfarb, is here. Mr. Himelfarb is a former clerk of the Privy Council and secretary to the federal cabinet in Ottawa, and it's nice to have you here at TVO.
It's great to see you again, Steve.
Well, the suggestion in the title of the book, of course, is that it's about time for an adult conversation on taxation in the country. Why do you think the time is ripe for that?
Well, let me start with your introduction. Let me start where you started, which it was the 2-cent cut to GST between 06 and 08. Because that was the impetus for rethinking taxes. And as you say, it was not a surprise that they cut the tax, that the government cut the tax. They had promised they were going to do it, and so that was an election promise made and kept. As well, politically, Canadians hate that tax.
They hated it from the minute Brian Mulroney brought it in.
And they see it every time they pay. They see it every single time they pay.
They get a haircut, they buy a cup of coffee, it's always there.
And when you buy a car, it's there in big measure,
time.
right? So they hate it, everybody just about, except for economists. And so no surprise that they did this. But still a hugely interesting tax cut for 3 reasons. Number one, it came after the biggest tax cut in Canadian history in 2000. So between 2000 and 2005, taxes had come down $100 billion.
And the Liberals had cut those taxes. That's Chrétien Martin.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. And so there was no huge urgent, this was tax cuts on top of huge tax cuts. Number one, that's pretty interesting. By the way, that tax cut was only one part of their tax cut agenda, corporate taxes, boutique taxes, up to about $45 billion a year. So it was on top, there was no urgent need to cut the taxes. That made it interesting. The second thing that made it interesting is every economist that I've ever spoken to thought this was the worst tax in the world to cut.
Except for one.
Except for the economist
in
chief.
Minister.
The economist in chief and his 2IC, I guess, thought it was okay, but most economists thought this was not the tax to cut. It's a smart tax, it doesn't hurt productivity, and it produces a lot of income because it's got a large base. So they thought that was the tax of the future, not the tax to be cut. That was the second thing. But the third thing, and for me the most interesting, was that there was no pushback. The opposition didn't ask, what are the consequences of taking $14 billion, additional $14 billion, out of the federal treasury? What are the costs of these tax cuts? Everybody treated it as though it was a free good, as though there were no consequences, as though there were no costs.
Because you can't be against tax cuts today. Politically, it's poison.
There you go. Therefore, the book. How did we get here? I mean, we all know that taxes are the way we pay for the things we decide to do together. You know, we buy shoes alone, we buy Medicare together. We know that taxes are the thing. Safe water, infrastructure, roads, Medicare, education. It's how we pay for those things we do together. How did we get to tax being a no-go zone?
A four-letter word.
A four-letter word. Political suicide to run on a tax increase. How did we get there?
What's the answer to that?
Well, I mean, you can track it to at least 3-4 decades of anti-tax rhetoric. Anti-tax rhetoric that didn't start with, but crystallized with Reagan, Thatcher, that kind of neoliberal view of the economy. You know, that was a time in the late 70s, early 80s where we were dealing with economic stagnation, we were dealing with inflation, people were nervous about whether we'd overbuilt. It was ripe, especially in the Anglo countries. We were ripe for a kind of a new regime, let the market do things. Cut government, make government smaller, reduce its footprint, get it out of the way to some extent, focus it on protecting life, liberty, and property, and not economics and social development. But it was a hard sell. How is it a hard sell? Because for 3 decades, we grew to love, in Canada, Medicare, education. You can't win on taxes, but you can't win on let's kill Medicare. Let's drive tuitions through the roof. Let's erode infrastructure, let's kill our environment. That's not a good agenda either.
No, but somewhere along the way, much of the public came to believe that taxes didn't represent how we pay for services.
Exactly,
It
they got
represented
decoupled.
how politicians take money out of my pocket and spend it on stupid stuff.
That was a deliberate campaign. The campaign was constantly that if we reduced taxes, they would pay for themselves. That somehow we could do that without reducing services. Originally, they argued it would generate so much economic activity that they would pay for themselves. You certainly can't tax the job creators. We'll lose jobs, right? Later, because that never pans out, there are always consequences. There are always costs to tax cuts. Then we say, okay, we'll get the gravy train. And there's enough gravy always to point to that make it sound like there are scandals and horrible expenditures that we should hold governments to account, but the numbers never add up.
So what's the consequence of the $14 billion a year foregone by cutting the GST 2 points?
Well, 14 and all of the other tax cuts, in the context of all the other tax cuts, I would say the two big consequences. One of them is lost resiliency. Imagine how much more easily we would have managed the meltdown in 2008 with a surplus. And a surplus gives you real resiliency. We wouldn't be dealing with debt today. So one of them is lost resiliency. But the enduring consequence is we've opened the door to the politics of austerity. And now we pretend that we have no choice because of all these tax cuts. We have no choice but to cut services, to cut programs, to cut.
Because you can't raise taxes.
Because you can't raise taxes. And we pretend that there is no alternative. In Canada, austerity has a particular shape. It's different from others. It's largely self-imposed because it's the result of 3 decades of tax cuts. And because our fiscal situation is really the envy of almost every rich country, we can do it in increments. So it's really hard to generate opposition, or it mutes the opposition because it happens in ways that are incremental. This is a revolution in increments because austerity is a way of reducing the footprint of government and changing its role.
But is that, do you think, you obviously had the number one job in the public service in Ottawa and watched this firsthand. Do we now hate government so much that we want to deprive government of adequate resources so that they won't meddle in our lives more than we want them to?
Yeah, I think that's a huge part of it. I think it's partly that we're oblivious to the consequences, and we should talk a little bit about the consequences.
Okay.
But and that's not unrelated. Let me come to your question indirectly. So the consequences of austerity. What are the consequences? Because they're slow and incremental and sometimes hard to see. The first consequence is that we snatch services from those who need it most. Look at refugees who can't get medical attention that they need. Look at migrants who pay into the EI system but can't draw benefits out because of new laws. Prisoners, the most disadvantaged, who have been stripped of meager resources that they would use to reintegrate as law-abiding, tax-paying citizens. We are at record lows of the proportion of unemployed people who can access the employment insurance scheme for training and help to get back into the labor market.
You've just listed 3 groups of people who don't vote.
Exactly. So, which is why they get away with it. But it does make us a meaner country. It does make us a meaner country. The first consequence falls on the most vulnerable. And do we really want to be a meaner country? Apparently. I hope not. The second consequence, though, is more enduring and affects us. The first consequence, by the way, does affect us all. Inequality affects everybody. It's a drag on the economy. It's a drag on society.
IMF says that now.
IMF says it. Everybody says it now. It's inescapable. So they don't vote, but we're all affected by it. The second consequence, though, is more enduring, more insidious, and that is we erode our collective capacity to deal with the big, tricky collective problems. You pick the problem. Pick it. Is it stagnant economy and youth underemployment? I think so. Is it climate change? Absolutely. Is it growing inequality? The IMF says so. We can't even touch those things because we've eroded our redistributive instruments, we've eroded government. And when you erode, and by the way, it's a conjurer's trick. It's a magic trick. It's distraction. So we say, look at how bad government is. Look, big government. Big government's the problem. But that's the misdirection. Climate change is the problem. big government isn't going to melt the planet. Climate change, inequality is, and it's distracting us from the real problems. And I would argue it stunts the political imagination. It makes nothing seem possible. You say at a dinner party, we should have universal childcare. Good childcare that develops early learning and that sets kids up to succeed. And people will say, great idea, how would we ever pay?
Right.
Taxes. Well, almost any of the issues that we talk about, income security change, getting more people into EI training, is going to take some resources.
Okay, let's assume then that there are people out there who don't believe tax is a four-letter word, who would be prepared to pay more tax in order to support the kinds of things you're talking about, but then pick up their newspaper and they see $1 billion blown on a gas plant that ought not to have been canceled or was canceled too late. Doesn't that jeopardize everything that you're trying to start here in terms of an adult conversation on these matters?
Oh, no question. I mean, governments are going to have to demonstrate that they care about the resources they collect, that they spend wisely. Tax and spend has become a term of pejorative. It's silly because that's what governments do. They tax and they spend. But they ought to tax fairly and they ought to spend wisely. And so, of course, they have an obligation. But we also, and the media also, you guys also exaggerate the proportion of those things we should hold governments to account. We should be angry. I get angry. My kids get angry. You get angry. Fair deal. We should hold politicians to account. But as a proportion of total spending, it's almost always insignificant. They're big numbers. But if you look at it proportionally, there's never enough gravy to justify the tax cuts. The tax cuts always hit services. So yeah, we have to clean up how we spend, but it's a separate issue. And we have to hold governments to account, but we can't pretend that 1%, say, of our budget justifies a 10% cut in taxes.
Fair enough. But you've had several authors have a kick at this, and they're all there in your book. Do you, having looked at many different solutions to this, do you have a prescription you like?
Well, the book does have a chapter on kind of broad directions. It doesn't pretend to provide a recipe for a new tax regime, but it does provide some directions. I would start, even before we get there, by saying we shouldn't make things worse. The current proposals to do income splitting or increase the tax-free savings account, which benefit the most affluent Canadians, but take a lot of money out of the Treasury, probably not a good idea.
So Jim Flaherty was right, Stephen Harper was wrong.
That's how you frame it. I frame it, let's not make things worse.
Okay.
And we ought to collect the taxes we're supposed to collect, and we should clamp down on evasion and
don't do
avoidance.
that now. I see that in the provincial auditor's report almost every year. They say that, well, I know the Ontario example, we're foregoing hundreds of millions of dollars in revenues because we just don't collect the taxes that we're entitled to collect right now.
I think of the irony. Austerity cuts what? Some of the people in the revenue agency who would be collecting these taxes. So we ought to collect these taxes. And some of that's going to take global solutions, working with our international partners. We ought to be a leader on that. But having said that, let me, instead of try to, if you can bear with me, let me give you 5 principles for what a new tax regime could. Principle number 1, we're all going to have to pay our fair share.
What does that mean?
Means that taxes like the HST and GST are an important part of our future. They're smart, they have a big base, they produce the revenues, and while they're regressive taxes can be used for progressive purposes.
That's number 1.
Number 1. And so we should, cutting that was, in my view, a very costly decision. Number 2, it's smart to be progressive. The social contract requires that people need to believe the tax system is fair, especially with growing inequality. There's room at the tax to increase the taxes on the very rich. And the corporations, a simple principle is this. I mean, if those who benefit most from Canada's advantages ought to pay the highest share.
Not controversial.
Right? And I think that you could make the same case for corporations. The economists don't like this too much, but you can make the same case for corporations that are sitting around on huge amounts of cash right now, that those who benefit most from Canada's advantage should do most to preserve it and share it.
That's number 2.
So that's number 2.
Number 3.
Number 3, I think we should treat all income more or less the same. So right now we give a huge advantage to returns on capital, to stock options and capital gains. way bigger than, say, inflation would require, way bigger. And that advantage is, again, the most affluent.
That's how Mitt Romney pays an effective tax rate of 15% and his secretary pays 35%.
That's exactly right. That's what Warren Buffett was talking about. That because and as inequality grows, a greater and greater portion of tax comes from wealth. So we ought to treat most income, or all income, as more or less the same. That's number 3.
Number 4.
Number 4 is we ought to tax most of the things we like least. Pollution, emissions, I would argue financial speculation.
Smoking.
Smoking, I'm good with that. I wouldn't have been 10 years ago, but I am
But you are now.
And finally, I think we have to make sure that we limit how much your future position, your position in life, depends on what you inherited.
You want to bring back inheritance taxes?
Absolutely. And you can protect the first 3 million, the first 4 million. You don't have to say to people you can't take care of your kids, your family. But how much advantage and how much privilege do we really want? If we truly believe in equality of opportunity, do we? And by the way, inheritance becomes increasingly important as inequality grows.
Yes. So
there you go. There's a set of principles.
That's the 5-point plan. Now here's the next thing. You're a man whose job it was in the past to come up with policy ideas, but you never had to sell them. The selling of these ideas is what politicians do. Do you think there's a politician alive today who has enough leadership skills, who can captivate an audience enough to sell this? Because this is a hard sell. I don't have to tell you. Some of this stuff will be a hard sell.
A lot of that stuff would be a hard sell, and you can't sell it all at once. But most of this, I would say 2 things. First of all, a lot of that change will come from the bottom up. We're seeing it in municipalities in the States and in Canada because they have no place to download the consequences of tax cuts.
They're the last line.
They're the last line. And so, you want a subway, no matter what you think about the gravy train, you're going to have to pay for it. You have traffic gridlock, and transit's going to be a place where the tax discussion changes in Ontario. There's nothing you can do except get the revenue. So sometimes circumstances bottom up force the conversation, and you can see it breaking in municipality and after municipality in Canada. Unfortunately, municipalities don't have good tax tools. They're stuck with property taxes that don't grow with the growing economy. So they need help from the provinces. So you're going to see it push up. Okay, so it is happening. It's happening in New York City, and it's happening in Boston, and it's happening in Missouri.
On a scale of 1 to 10, the political courage required to get that through would be a 247, right?
Yeah, that's exactly the right number. I think that's right. So the conversation on the outside, great change happens on the outside. If we have this conversation, if we're able to change the conversation, we create at least more room, and then media as well, by the way, we create more room for what politicians can't do right now or feel they can't do right now. So part of the job of a conversation is to create the room to do the right thing. It's going to change. It's going to change because the consequences will become unbearable. It's going to change because we have to deal with these problems. The question is, how much pain before that happens? How much, and it's harder and harder to reverse things because if we don't fix these problems, they tend to get worse. They don't just stay the same. So how much pain before we turn, and maybe, just maybe, there's a politician there who cares to win because they can't do anything if they don't win, but is prepared to take the risk of having an honest conversation.
We shall see. Tax is not a 4-letter word. The co-editor, Alex Himelfarb, has been our guest. Good of you to come into TVO tonight. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Steve. Really, thank you.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.